We are now going to move immediately to a conversation on building more energy, moderated by Lisa Hansman. I will introduce Lisa, and then she will introduce the rest of the panelists. Lisa is a Yale-trained lawyer, though we won't hold that against her. She's held important roles on the Hill in the White House. She is a director at Foundry Logic and a CEPR policy fellow. I will embarrass her in saying I think I've not been the only person who has worked with Lisa, been so impressed by her capabilities that I have reflected on the following scenario. I think if I am successful in my career, I may be so lucky that one day she will call me up and ask me to work for her, and I'll be on the next flight. So thank you for joining us, Lisa, and looking forward to the panel.
Neil, thank you so much for that overly generous introduction. I would not be here today in many ways if it wasn't for Neil. Really excited to be here with you all talking about what I think at least is the most pressing economic question that faces us today, which is how do we expand the supply side of the energy economy? And I think we find ourselves in a really interesting moment where for the first time in over 2 decades, the question or the most pressing market policy issue in energy is not one of insufficient demand, but one of insufficient supply. And we are starting to develop a language to talk about how to expand the supply side, but we haven't actually seen much tangible progress. And so incredibly excited to be talking to the 4 august people you see on this stage here about how we change that. So just to start out with introductions, Duncan over here is the guy on distributed energy resources. He is a founder of Scale Microgrids, and where he's the VP of project development, and also the founder of the Distributed Energy Resources Task Force. Rick is literally commercializing fusion, which is awesome, and he's the chief commercial officer at Commonwealth Fusion Systems. But that I think undersells his importance in the climate tech ecosystem, where he helped commercialize a range of technologies and deployed billions of dollars from TPG Rise and from seats at Google. And then we've got Tyler Norris, who has had multiple roles, developer, I was hearing last night, analyst, and now researcher and scholar at Duke University, where his work focuses on bulk power electronic systems. And I think most importantly for our purposes, I was on Twitter yesterday, and I think I saw that Tyler's paper from this year on how we respond to load growth was described as the hottest academic paper in energy markets. So for the students in the room, find him after and pull him aside and learn his secrets. And then Varsha Sarveshwar, so excited to have her on this panel. She's the newly promoted, I believe, Deputy Director of Policy at California's Division of Petroleum Market Oversight, and from that perch is helming the watchdog that supervises oil and gas markets here in California, and probably has a more nuanced understanding of the role of market power in constraining the supply side of energy markets than just about anyone else. So really excited to dig in with all of you. Maybe we'll start the conversation on the negative, as all good conversations begin, and would love to have you all go around and say a few words about what it is that you think from your respective perch is the single greatest barrier to expanding energy capacity today. So what's our biggest abundance fail? Duncan, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure, I'll start. I think I'm going to come at it from a maybe unique lens. We're probably going to hear a lot about how technology and innovation can expand supply, and how dealing with our highly permissioned system can expand supply. I'm going to talk about how actual distribution of electricity is constraining supply right now. Unlike, say, for comparison, retail gasoline costs, where distribution and marketing is like 15% of the cost, and electricity is half the cost. So when we talk about abundance of electricity, we're talking about power plants, but we're also talking about the grid. And increasingly, those grid costs, those delivery costs, are becoming more and more of your bill, right? So if one proxy for abundance is low price, if we want to achieve low price, even if we sort out how do you build a power plant and get it through NEPA and CEQA and all that stuff, and even if we sort out how can we make the best power plant ever, if the cost of distributing electricity keeps rising faster than inflation, as it is in about half the country, it won't matter. So to me, the biggest sort of energy abundance fail we're facing right now is we're setting ourselves up to basically eat away all the progress we make on the supply side by not dealing with the issues we have on the distribution side.
Yeah, I first of all, thanks for having me here, Lisa and Sieper. I think I'll take also a unique perspective, and that I talk about fusion. But so there's huge challenges, as John and Derek talked about in the first session there, in deploying infrastructure and deploying projects. So yes, as Duncan rightly mentions, getting things deployed, large sources of generation, has been really challenging. We have more than twice the grid capacity of the U.S. sitting in queues. Like twice what we have today is sitting in queues. So that's a huge issue. One of the benefits that having a dense, clean, firm power source has is you could actually locate it relatively close to the load. And so that, I'm not saying that would go away. You still need to interconnect it, but it's actually would be close to load. It's easier. There's big, potential customers of ours that have been working with utilities to try and get tariffs in place that make this easier. I want the generation. I have a big load. It's impossible to connect it. Can I do something to solve that? Yes. So that is definitely one issue that needs to be solved. But the fact is there's so much demand, there's so much potential growth in that demand that we also need to be, there's always this sometimes a false dichotomy of do either innovative thing versus deploy tons of what you got, or it's the distributed versus central. It's like the fact is we have so much demand, we need all of it. And in fact, I think Tyler talked about better ways to squeeze out more of our existing system. We need all of that in order to actually reach this abundance agenda where we have as much energy as we need, as affordably as we need, as reliably as we need. And we can talk more about why I think fusion could be a real central bit of that. And obviously, the challenge we face is like, let's prove that it works. Got it? Yeah, we're on it. But there's so many other things that we need to solve too with respect to how do you actually deploy infrastructure? And it comes back to this abundance agenda and addressing that from all sides of the aisle, basically. It shouldn't be bipartisan. It should be nonpartisan.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks so much to the Sieper team for pulling this together. So my research has focused a lot on integration of large loads and large generators. And this is complex stuff, and there's a lot of sort of terminology. So maybe to offer an analogy, it helps. So the way our current sort of grid access scheme works is, so imagine that you're a trucking company, and you've just ordered a new truck, and you're excited to get it on the highways and start shipping your product. And what you're told is that, well, hold on, we've got to do a study first, and it could take 2 to 3 years. And what we have to do under the study is that we need to make sure that your truck can access every portion of the U.S. roadway system. But not just that, it has to be able to access every portion of the roadway system during an extreme blizzard, during the height of rush hour. And if there is any point where you can't access the road, we're going to have to expand the roadways, and then we're going to assign all of the costs of that roadway expansion to you, and you have to pay all of that up front and then wait for those upgrades to get completed before you can put your truck on the highways. And that's basically the way we do generator interconnection everywhere in the United States outside of Texas. And we've designed this resource adequacy construct which links interconnection service both for new generators and loads that requires them to be what we call fully deliverable under peak conditions and under extreme contingencies. we have intentionally designed via an administrative policy decision an extremely high barrier to entry for new generators and loads. Actually, on the load side, what we do is we just socialize all the costs, and so they can usually get online more quickly. And so what this all adds up to is that we actually have an incredibly low utilization rate of the existing power system. And when you look at the numbers for the US, on average, how much we utilize our existing grid and generation capacity is about 53%, which means that on average, in any given hour, about half of the US power system sits unused. And so we've basically over-engineered to accommodate a very small number of extreme swings in demand during cold snaps like polar vortexes and extreme heat waves. And if we want to move fast, we can actually add a lot of new load and a lot of new generators to the existing grid if they're able and willing to be flexible in a small number of hours a year so they don't add to more stress during these stress grid conditions. And just to quickly put a number on it, and then we'll move on, in this study that was mentioned and which I testified to Congress about 2 months ago, what we found is that if the new data centers, for example, were able to be flexible for 0.25% of their maximum potential uptime, so 1/4%, meaning they wouldn't put additional stress on these peak periods, we could add, and this is a first order approximation of technical potential, we could add 76 gigawatts of additional load across the US, which exceeds upper end forecasts for load growth in the US over the next 7 years. And so if we can take this approach of getting more utilization out of the existing system, we can move a lot faster. And then just to connect the dots to Rick's technology here, we can buy time and save capital so that we can wait for clean firm to scale, which we're going to need to meet our goals, post-2030s. And what's happening right now, and I'll finish on this, because of this current paradigm and how we do system planning, we are barreling forward to have massive expansion of gas capacity, including combined cycle units that will be on the system for 30 plus years and want to operate at relatively high capacity factors. And if we overbuild on gas, we are going to crowd out clean firm technologies that are going to want to start scaling in the early 2030s to mid 2030s. So I'm excited to dig into more of that.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa, and thanks to the SEPR team for having me. I want to preface my comments with the usual disclaimers. I'm excited to speak as a state policymaker, but don't certainly represent, California or the Energy Commission or anything like that. It's interesting at the Division Petroleum Market Oversight at DPMO, we're thinking about, well, as you have emerging markets where we're thinking about abundance, how do we think about the market that's a little bit in decline? So we need more capacity on the grid because, in part, more and more Californians are electrifying their homes, electrifying their transportation. And so that has impacts on the petroleum market, which is what we work on. And so California, every year, gasoline demand declines by 1% to 2%. Renewable diesel has grown so much in California that it's displaced about half of petroleum diesel demand. Even still, California is the 4th largest gasoline market in the world, something like the 4th largest. During peak demand parts of the year or in the summer, looking at about 1 gallon per day per Californian consumed. And so we still have a very huge market that needs to be served, but it's in decline, and market participants are responding to that by taking supply off the market faster than demand is coming down. And so that requires us to really think about how we manage that market and how we think about that market, because Californians are still dependent on these products. We need them to be safe, reliable, and affordable. And so we can't tolerate price spikes or price volatility or things in the market that are very damaging to consumers, very damaging to our economy. And so it's sort of the flip side of abundance and the electrification side that we're thinking about, well, what is abundance and what is affordability and what do these policy principles look like on the petroleum side? And that's been a really interesting and I think a newer question for the state to start thinking about as we sort of see these long-run consequences of demand decline. And so really excited to talk about that today and about some of the dynamics in the petroleum market.
Yeah. So let's start with the grid dilemma, which has come up repeatedly, both in the comments earlier today and here right now. It is obvious that constraints on grid capacity have turned transmission interconnection into perhaps the greatest choke point for deployment on the generation side. But there are a range of ways that one could engage with the grid. Do we invest all of our efforts in terms of physical expansion? Do we change the rules on how performance gets rewarded? Do we put pressure on the demand side to create flexibility? Tyler, maybe we can start with you for an overview of what the options are and what you think the trade-offs are, and then want to hear from folks who are in the market about how they're actually navigating those trade-offs.
Yeah, sure thing. I think the first piece, which is kind of the most obvious and where we thought there was alignment, was on doing multi-value, multi-scenarios, proactive transmission planning. That's what FERC Order 1920 is all about. That's what Manchin-Barraza would have actually strengthened a lot. And it's just a no-brainer, right? Like, we should actually plan the transmission system in response to the futures that we expect. And it seems obvious, but we haven't been doing this. And we've only been doing it on like 5 to 10-year forecasts. And part of what we need to do is extend that timeline out to 20 years, account for a broader range of benefits when we do the cost-benefit analysis of new transmission. So that should be a no-brainer. Like, we need to push forward on Order 1920. I hope we can have some bipartisan agreement on that. I mean, the second is, we don't necessarily, like, it's going to be really hard to do greenfield transmission. I think everyone knows it's going to take a long time. We need to keep pushing on it. But in the meantime, we can still upgrade the existing grid, just upgrade the existing rights of way and the existing transmission lines by doing reconductoring. And with advanced conductors, we can actually, in some cases, double the amount of transmission capacity. And this is what we do anytime we sort of talk about thermal upgrades to the system. But so we can do a lot with existing rights of ways, the existing grid. But then the third category is sort of how to get more utilization out of the existing grid or whatever grid we're building to. And this is the whole category of grid enhancing technologies. But I do want to make a plug for, I think there's a whole category of grid enhancing technology that hasn't really been discussed very much yet. And it kind of relates to what I was just saying. So there's actually a lot of headroom on the existing transmission system that we don't allow access to because we operate the system to what we call N-1 conditions. And this does make sense in a certain paradigm, but it does leave a lot of capacity unused. And so there's kind of this new category emerging. I've actually been talking with the folks that are developing these technologies to try to come up with one term to capture it. And I think what we're coming around is dynamic contingency management. And it's basically the concept that loads or generators can serve essentially as N-1 reserve capacity in a way that allows us to tap into more of the existing transmission headroom. So I think there are a lot of exciting sort of emerging technologies and practices that will help us in that regard.
Rick, I'm curious, there's been so much conversation around, in some senses, fully bypassing the grid and co-locating with large loads, and hyperscalers have been at the forefront of that conversation. How are you navigating that decision from your side? And how do you think the grid looks 10, 20 years from now? Are we in this bifurcated world of a grid for the haves and the have-nots?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say, frankly, I think the utilities are, the word's been used about getting stuff done. They're scared stuffless in some sense because they have some of their biggest customers, the ones who are actually going to generate growth for those utilities, telling them, if you can't build this for me, I'm going to go do it on my own. I'm going to go build a power plant, and I'm going to build my data center or whatever. I'm going to put them together, and screw your system. I'm going to be off it. Like, so utilities themselves are like, my God, this is an existential. This is a paradigm shift. By the way, this gets to how do utilities actually build out infrastructure? How the whole utility model probably needs to change. They don't even have the equity to go build the amount of growth that they need, let alone if they get approval from their commissions to do it. So some of these big companies have seen these delays on load and generation getting sourced. They're getting utilities saying, no, you can't build that gigawatt-sized learning data center because there's no way I can go power a gigawatt. And so what are they left to do? Figure it out on their own. And they don't want to. They don't want to. Like, I was at Google when we signed our first, power purchase agreement. It wasn't something like we jumped up and said, let's go do this. It's like because we couldn't get what we wanted when I was at Google. We're now in the same place. They can't get what they want. And so we have, some potential customers coming to us and saying, wow, if I could build a fusion power plant right next to co-located behind the meter or adjacent to my data center, that could allow me to avoid the long line, the long queue to get interconnect. Now, I would say we the smart people in those companies who know power know that that's, doing a behind-the-meter deployment of whether it's a fusion power plant, some are looking at SMRs, some are looking at gas plants, some are doing gas plants. By the way, if you try to build a new gas plant, that's like 5 or 6 years to get built. Like gas is not fast. Like that's a misnomer. Go talk to people building gas plants. If you want to order a turbine, the earliest you can get is about 2030. So they're trying to figure out, how can I do this? And some of the folks in those companies are thinking, if I did it behind the meter, that's a really elegant solution. I don't need a connection to the grid. We would argue that that doesn't make a ton of sense. Like for a first of a kind fusion plant, we would not argue for that. Now, if you extend the horizon to 20, 30 years from now, like what would that look like? I don't know. Would infrastructure now be deployed such that you could deploy a power plant next to it? And by the way, a fusion power plant is a lot easier to deploy than like a fission plant, and we can go through all the regulations and rules and permitting. But basically, we could permit ours in 18 months and less than 10 million, as opposed to 5 to 10 years and 500 million to $1 billion. That's just that's getting the license part. That's not building it. And why do we know that? Because we did it in Boston already, outside Boston. We're doing it. We're in that activity of doing it right now for our first power plant. We announced is going to be in Virginia. But this whole question of the interconnect is, why did we announce our first power plant project in Virginia, which we did back in December? Well, that's because there's a long pole in this tent, and it's called interconnect. And we would, otherwise probably have waited to say, here's where we're going to build it. But we need to start now. We literally have people in our organization now working through an interconnect for the first fusion power plant, because that's going to be on the line in the early 2030s. And if we didn't start now, we'd be behind the curve. So yes, there's a vision in the future where large loads could potentially deploy, where they can deploy, substantial power dense, power sources for their infrastructure. And data centers is one of them, but there's manufacturing, there's other things. So there's metals making. But today, the world we live in today necessitates that we work with organized markets and do permitting. And Texas would be a fast place to go. You can do that too. But we need to figure this out for the long term. And maybe there's a solution where power plants get deployed with those large bits of infrastructure. I think we're going to need to work through the permitting and the interconnect now. And there's a bunch of rules that are changing too. This makes it also interesting with FERC orders and with the PJM and MISO. Those things are all changing. So we'll see how it goes. But we've had to start early. We're excited about the opportunity to potentially adjacently locate and make it easier.
Could I just add one thing?
Yes.
This is all playing out right now in real time in PJM in a docket in front of FERC right now that's focused on co-location. And the future is being written in this docket right now, and there's this huge debate happening between Constellation and PJM. And the basic situation is one that we sort of described already, which is that generally all new load is treated as what we call network load, and then is planned as firm at every level, which then translates to a lot of required upgrades. And what Constellation is saying is, no, we need an option to be basically a non-firm or a quasi-firm load that could account for having some co-located generation. And by the way, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're islanding at all. It just means they could run that backup generation for those, right, we're talking about 50 to 100 hours a year during periods of system stress, so they don't put more burden on that existing system and trigger a bunch of upgrades. And it's remarkable that we don't have, in most markets, transmission service that is not network load, and it just goes to show how the regulatory system is just not keeping pace with the technological and sort of market innovations right now.
How do we get regulatory reform in that space? Where are we seeing it, if anywhere?
Yeah, I would just say, I think right now there's an opportunity for FERC to nudge PJM to create those kind of service tiers. And we need, but the great news is we don't have to wait on FERC and PJM to get this right. Every electricity market can move on its own right now. And what's nice about this actually is that load is still considered state jurisdictional. And so states can move forward in creating these flexible service tiers right now, including in California. So I think we just need to be pressing forward in each market to get these new service tiers set up, and hopefully nudge some of the large loads to embrace a little bit of flexibility so that we can get more utilization of the existing system.
Yeah, and I think one thing we've seen is governors of states, to this point, are pushing the organized markets to get moving and allow them some flexibility here. Why? Because like large loads, large businesses are not coming to their states because I can't get the power I need. And so the governors think, I got 1,000 jobs here and billions of dollars of investment that could come in if I could solve this. So organized market, like, let's solve this. So there's a lot of motion to do that. And I'm hoping it can result in something especially beneficial to clean firm power. You can come on and you can help. But some of these solutions, like having more flexible load tiers, makes a ton of sense.
Something that comes to mind for this proportion of loads that do choose to sort of bring their own power, right? And there's a bunch of project announcements here. We'll see how many actually happen, but there's the aptly named Abundance Corporation in Texas building a gigawatt-scale off-grid industrial energy park. There's Intersect Power, a great California business doing this with solar storage and small gas generators. And our business is doing some of this too. Whatever proportion of these off-grid data centers get built, in a number of years, they will connect to the grid. Right, it's kind of crazy not to. If you have power, you have excess power. If you want to expand the site, it's always good to network these loads, even if the off-grid let you move faster, which is what everyone's really interested in. But there's a second thing they might do too, which at the moment is entirely illegal, which is they might be the nodes of new grids, right? If you think of like how industry is planned in like a place like Shenzhen, right? You'll have a big power plant, you'll have a big factory, you'll have another factory that uses the byproducts of that factory, and you kind of have this like industrial economic zone that's like highly integrated, right? If you build a big gigawatt scale data center in the middle of the desert in West Texas, eventually someone's going to want to put something next to that and need power. And those sites could be the beginnings of a new power system, right? And connect to those, to their neighbors, sell them power. But right now that's completely illegal, right? The monopoly utility has the sole right to distribute power within its franchise. This is very constraining for the future when taken in the context of what I said earlier, which is distribution costs for electricity are rising faster than inflation in much of America. Here in California, the lights we're all sitting under, the distribution costs here are rising at like 7, 8, 9% per year, like vastly higher than inflation. We need a reset. And I'm not saying complete reset everywhere, but we need to allow little experiments like this to happen. And we need to see if new technologies and new paradigms, whether it's fusion, solar and storage, et cetera, can actually give us a chance to inject some competition in the actual distribution of power, and to sort of write that off completely and say, that'll never be useful, I think is a really big mistake we're potentially going to make. But it's a very, very difficult thing to advocate for. Challenging the utility monopoly is good luck. But I want to see someone do it, because I really do think if we do not at least entertain this, we're writing off like a whole future path that may be critical to abundance.
What would it look like to do?
I mean, it would, pretty much what I just said.
What?
No, I mean, right, like this is how the power system evolved originally, right? Right, where folks started networking together, realizing like law of large numbers and like utilization and all this stuff. And then, Sami Insull figured out he could just sort of wrap the whole thing up with the state's blessing. And this was a good idea. It just seems like this, we have an opportunity to sort of try that again, and I'd hate to miss it.
Tyler, are you going to jump
Well, I was going to say, I mean, just to connect dots here, I mean, one of the reasons that the cost of delivery is going up so much here is because of wildfire sort of hardening. And part of what's going on there too is that you're treating all the loads effectively the same, which has been the paradigm that we do load planning, right? It's like, there's actually like an obligation to serve all new loads and to treat them all as fully formed network loads. And when you start doing this in the paradigm of large load growth, it becomes untenable, because one thing happens is you end up socializing the costs of all upgrades that are necessary to serve the new load. And so that ends up, when you're talking about serving far-flung regions where you're trying to harden the grid to, that can dramatically escalate costs. And it can also, when we're talking about data centers being added, socializing those costs is already a huge backlash against it. So I think I just wanted to connect the dot there. Like, we need a whole new paradigm for how we plan for new load, and some existing loads that it may be better off to put them on their own island in the system or otherwise.
And I'll just quickly say I totally agree with Tyler. I painted a picture of like working outside of or against the system. There's also a way these distributed energy resources can totally work with the system. We own a very large fleet of batteries that are at commercial and industrial sites behind the meter around the country. There's only one state in which we operate where our batteries receive a price signal from the monopoly utility saying, if you discharge now, we can actually reduce the long-run costs of power distribution by, reducing load on some substation somewhere or something like that. New York State is the only one. We own a lot of batteries in California, and not a single one helps the distribution network. Not because we don't want to, because there literally is no price signal to do so. So instead, what we do is we help customers save money, we reduce their charges, we get into fights with the utility about, cost shifting and all that stuff.
So we've talked about the state in various ways, and Varsha can tell that I'm staring at her now. Varsha, what's the role of state policy innovation in addressing some of the issues that we've raised here?
Yeah, my ears perked up when you started talking about competition. In the petroleum market, this is a huge issue. So, you'll be familiar with the company Standard Oil. Standard Oil was broken up in the early 20th century, and many of the sort of Standard Oil products essentially continued and are now the major oil companies that we see today that have a lot of market power in the United States and around the world. In California, 4 companies control 90% of in-state gasoline refining capacity. By the end of the year, that's going to go to about 98%. And in the rest of the US, that C4 concentration ratio is about 48%. So we have a really concentrated market in California. And that means that the sort of normal supply-demand rules don't completely follow in the same way here. So we've had a number of price spikes in California in the past several years where gasoline prices have gone to over $6 a gallon. And if you're talking about abundance, you can't build or plan in a long-term sustainable way if the cost of such basic commodities is not predictable and affordable. And so a lot of what we've been doing is trying to unpack why that's happening. Well, in California, what seems to happen is we have, during the summer, during the really peak demand periods, kind of just enough supply to meet demand, barely. We might have to bring in some imports here and there, but it's on the edge. And then a refinery goes down for planned maintenance because they're working at high temperatures, high pressures, at hydrocarbons. The average age of a refinery in California is 100 years old. And so you can imagine how important that maintenance is. And they might have unplanned maintenance. We might have issues we don't expect. In Northern California, we've had 2 really major refinery upsets at 3 of, we've got 3 petroleum refineries in Northern California, and 2 of them have had upsets in the past several months. And so then what happens is there's this price volatility on the trading market where gasoline is traded, and that translates to the retail market very, very quickly. And well, then why doesn't, in a typical supply-demand situation, when you have an increase in price, that's a price signal to bring in new product. Unfortunately, California is pretty geographically isolated, so it can take a long time to import product. Okay, so then why aren't the refineries sort of storing additional, right? Why don't we have the buffer in the system so that when we have these kinds of outages, we're not sort of immediately bidding up the price to $5, $6 a gallon? Well, there might just not be an incentive to do that. The market incentive to do that might not exist, because if you're the refinery and you've gone offline, well, then you've gone offline, and you can just buy from the other refineries in order to sort of supply any contracts you have. And if you're operational, then why would you add additional supply to the market, right? You're essentially experiencing higher margins, higher prices, and we expect firms to be profit maximizing. So we wouldn't necessarily expect them to sort of inject that buffer, right? Price stability is not what they're solving for. And so it's a really good example of the kinds of market oversight and potentially intervention that you need in order to either ensure competition in the market or start to act and intervene when maybe you've got an oligopolistic market in this case, where that price stability is not exactly occurring. And even though it's on the petroleum side, it's got huge implications for the rest of the economy, costing Californians billions of dollars. It's bad for businesses. It's bad for local economic development. And so a lot of our work has been, okay, how can we start to think about this market in a more critical way, and then take the steps we need to stabilize prices?
Well, I'm happy you brought up the role of competition, because just put my 2 cents on the table. my sense is that in the abundance discourse, this role of market power and competition and the set of rules that are most relevant to different market structures has yet to be fully explored. And so I think that's an area where this room, and I know Neil and Ryan are doing a ton of work, but that is a story that I think continues to need to be unspooled and is particularly relevant, of course, in the utility context as well. But I want to take us down from the macro to the micro to talk about what it actually looks like to build right now and navigating some of the, let's call them non-monetary barriers to building. Rick, you are on the front lines of deploying projects right now. Can you talk us through kind of the very practical nitty-gritty, what it looks like, what the barriers that you are navigating along the steps to deployment actually are?
Sure, and I would be the first not to say that our power plant's micro, but it's but the micro challenges I think we face. We're going to be 400 megawatts, so a big sizable plant. We face some of the. So I would say there's a bifurcation here. We face some of the same challenges that any power generator would face. We talked about a few of those. Interconnect, developing a project and what you have to go through. NEPA, I think Derek had a great point. That NEPA is not actually, it's basically a relitigation of all the other things that you already got approved by another group of people that just takes a long time. So it's not, it can be a challenge. And are we going to be subject to NEPA or not? It's TBD. So there's that bit, and then I'd say there's the fusion-y bit, which is like a little bit different. Like what's the hoop that we have to go through as this odd fusion thing? So I'd say probably I'll touch on the fusion one quickly, but the most relevant thing is probably those other ones. The fusion-y bit, like the good news is a little bit like problem solved, which is like for our permitting for our plant, we recognize, and I give great credit to our company before I even joined it about 2.5 years ago, recognizing like to actually deploy fusion power, commercial fusion power on a grid and to actually have an impact on climate, like it's necessary but not sufficient to show a fusion plant that works. That is great. That's wonderful. But good news. You're now on the path to go do all those other things. So we've been inviting stakeholders in from the very beginning to make sure that we're set to actually scale. Part of that is working with regulators and key stakeholders to make sure there's a path to actually permit a fusion power plant. So again, good news. NRC decided a couple years ago now, voted unanimously. We're going to regulate fusion different than fission. We're going to regulate like a particle accelerator. So the same way that SLAC over here got approved, that's the way we get approved, which is basically you're responsibly managing the materials you have on site. Like we're not regulated on the plant design, we're not regulated on the plant operations, we're not regulated on the ancestry of every single bit and piece and part that goes in there, which also means we can also change the design as we go. So that's all good news. That was codified into law with the Advance Act last year as well. Good news. The other thing that we face, though, is just all the other stuff to get a power project built. And so, we're going through the process right now of getting a conditional use permit for our Virginia plant, which is like getting agreement from the county and the state that we can go build a fusion power plant. By the way, this is really interesting. Like we're sited at a place that really did not want our partner, Dominion, to go build a gas plant there. It was a site that was already ready to go. I'd already done a bunch of work on the environmental assessment and all that stuff, and it was kind of ready to go. But the community stood up and said, "We don't want this." So you can argue, was that good? Was it bad? But the community said, "We do not want a natural gas plant here." We actually went and said, "Wow, that's a really great site. It's really close for interconnect purposes to a hub. It's right off I-95, like a mile. It's got rail access, water access. It happens to be connected right in the Dominion system. All good. But there's a community that doesn't want a power plant." And we worked really hard and met with those people, met with the organized groups, and they were very excited about fusion. So that's a good thing. Our first town hall meeting ended in applause and people asking for jobs and internships for their kids. Good start. All right, we're not there yet, right? A good start. And we would never say that they're on board and we're going forward. Like we're working with them day by day. And this is just the hard work you have to do to get anything developed, really. They're actually really excited. This is the first time anyone's ever come to us in advance to tell us about what you're doing. And we think that's the way development should work. It mitigates risk. But there's so many hoops you have to go through. And again, we started this early because we just know especially the interconnect, is really, really challenging. And how do you interconnect the fusion plant? Well, we've been talking with PJM for a couple of years now, but what does that mean? Talking to other ISOs and RTOs as well. And just the process of, you do everything you can with the community, with the rules and how you actually would permit a plant, and it just takes a long time, and it just opens, the processes open themselves up to all kinds of challenges. And so we have to do the hard work, and we're doing it, to educate, to communicate. I mean, one of the first people that our company hired was someone whose title was Chief Movement Builder. What startup does that? And we just realized, if we're going to actually get fusion, we need to do all this work. And my previous experience in funding large-scale renewable energy projects at Google, we saw this in spades too with some of the projects that we worked on. I think Derek had mentioned the desert tortoise, which I love to death. But my God, if you look at, I won't say a number here, but if you looked at how much we pay per tortoise. God, I just think as a taxpayer, that could have gone to someone's education. That could have gone to, ecosystem development, whatever. It could have gone to so many things. And again, love them to death. But we probably saved more desert tortoises on that project than maybe had existed. I'll just leave it there. But let's not let perfect be the enemy of really good. And so I think this is part of what the abundance agenda is about. Let's get going. Let's build stuff, and let's understand those trade-offs. Everything's not absolute. If everything's absolute, that's a recipe for not getting anything done.
Yeah, and if I can come in there, I think one thing to really appreciate, and I've come to appreciate in this job, is there are some real valid fears that folks have. When we talk about petroleum refineries, there are emissions issues, there are issues with accidents, right? If it's easy to sort of talk about building, but if you're living next to one of these industrial facilities, it can be quite nerve-wracking. It can be quite scary. There's a lot of pressure, and that leads to sort of regulatory pressure and pressure to limit emissions, pressure to limit accidents, and so I can really understand that. And so it's understanding that anxiety. The other piece of it is, a lot of these communities end up with essentially one facility as their tax base, their major employer. And so when there's an issue where there's a transition, where a refinery is closing, that's a real issue just for that entire community. And so how do we think about connecting some of these ideas with the sort of place-based thinking as well, such that these transitions are working for communities, that those fears are being addressed, because sometimes they're really valid fears. They're coming from past experience. And so that's, I think, one insight I've come to appreciate in the petroleum context is I can really appreciate some of those concerns. And so how do we, and I think in some of the work that you've done, how do we really work with folks to get them, how do we work with communities, and how do we think through both the sort of the safety implications and the development implications, but also the economic implications of potentially having communities relying on a certain facility for a tax base or something like that when that transition occurs. And so those are really complex questions, and it's great that we're thinking about them.
I can't help but wonder if, in addition to figuring out how for a given location we can work with the community to ensure everything's being dealt with properly, we can also front end some stuff and designate some areas for development. The prolific Chinese automaker BYD is building a new factory right now for batteries, electric motors, and electric cars. It's the size of San Francisco. I'm not joking. It is the size of San Francisco. I looked at the video, the aerial footage of it, and I thought, we can never do this, right? And it's a little scary to consider that, right? If we actually want to keep up with this stuff, whether it's project development or manufacturing development, there's some element there as well of, in addition to just putting a pin on the map and saying this would be the perfect location, let's go talk to the local government. Can we designate some areas for big ambitious projects where we essentially say we are open for business, right? I think parts of Texas are kind of becoming that right now, not in a formalized way, but just it's happening. But I feel like this is pretty essential as well.
I think that's actually very optimistic. That's an area I will say I feel cautiously optimistic about, in that the Biden administration designated certain zones as solar zones, created categorical exclusions for certain types of technologies, geothermal chief among them, set up the Forge as a place where subsurface technologies could be tested. And you're seeing continuity there in the Trump administration, in that there hasn't been a rescission of an executive order that would encourage the use of federal land for co-located data center and power generation facilities. So at least to the abundance theme of areas of tenuous compromise, that seems to be one of them. But Tyler, you were gonna.
Well, I was just gonna, before I went into academia, I used to develop large-scale solar and storage projects. I've developed gigawatts of projects, mostly in the Southeast, and I just want to say, I think the NEPA conversation is really important, but we need to not lose sight. Like, in my experience, the biggest barrier was always county-level zoning dynamics, and I think we just need to be very clear-eyed. Like, there is a highly organized anti-renewable movement right now in the U.S. that is seeking to pass entire moratoriums on renewable development at a county and at a state level. And it's a really, really wicked problem to solve. I certainly don't have the answer, but I do just put it out there to the abundance movement to think about if there are ways, for example, we could incentivize states to streamline, so kind of take the carrot approach, and it's almost like a race to the top type model that Obama advanced, but for incentivizing states to sort of streamline and rationalize the process so that we don't have individual counties killing, critical projects.
Yeah, cultivating a culture of abundance is as important as policy enablers of abundance. Yeah.
Chief Movement Officer for the Abundance Movement also. So, yeah. Want to make sure we get time for audience questions as well.
Hey, Kate Gordon, great to see you guys. I'm really struck by Varsha, both you and Tyler talking about just the reality of the existing system into which we're trying to do this abundance movement. This is not a blank page. This is not a flat, frictionless world. We're talking about actual places with a lot of stuff that's already been built. Can you talk a little bit more, maybe both of you, Tyler, you talked about this in terms of load growth, but also existing load that's more far-flung, which is a huge part of the cost of electricity in this state, for sure. Varsha, obviously, you talked about the existing fossil fuel system, which is we're entirely dependent on still. How do you think about abundance in the context of existing built environments, of the existing, if everything is not a greenfield project? What are some tactical ways to kind of take this movement into that context, especially in this country where we've built out a lot of stuff and there's a lot of competing uses already for land? So just love to hear more on that.
Yeah, sure. Very hard question, Kate. I would say, just to offer some thoughts, right? The petroleum infrastructure in California is extremely old. Some of it is very, very old, and it's very large. I was driving this morning here from Sacramento, driving by a number of refineries, and just thinking, man, this is so much space. These are so many tanks. There's millions and millions of barrels of tank storage. And how do we transition that? It involves land use, it involves environmental concerns, remediation concerns, labor concerns, issues for the sort of economics, tax base of the surrounding community. I think we just have to be as creative as possible. In the context of petroleum, as you're sort of seeing declining demand and supply is coming off very quickly, the state is becoming more and more reliant on imports. And so we need to be a little bit, again, creative about how we use that infrastructure, both in terms of supplying the market, making sure that people have the gasoline that they need, but that it's affordable. So are there ways we can think about all of the tank storage that we've got, right? We don't necessarily need to build new petroleum storage tanks. We have a bunch of storage tanks on the existing refinery sites. And so can we use that in a way, can we encourage market participants to use that in a way to buffer the market? How do we think about our import infrastructure? How do we think about marine terminals? But they're super complex questions, and you have to think about them multidimensionally. I mean, we focus on the market side, but you have to think about the other pieces of it because, some of the special sessions that we've had, it's come up time and time again that the folks who are living in refinery communities, I mean, they're the people who work in the refineries. They're the people who live in cities that are reliant on that company as a tax base. They're the people most affected by particulates, NOx, VOCs. And so they're not asking us to solve one of those problems and not the other problems. They're asking us to solve all of the problems. And that's hugely ambitious with the incredibly large set of infrastructure that's been built over the last several decades that we're now trying to move. And so it's an all hands on deck effort, and there's no good idea off the table, I think.
I'll kind of zoom in at a micro level. And then, so I grew up in Western North Carolina, where my family still is, and they were hit hard by Hurricane Helene last fall. They were out of power for 10 days and no running water. And the thing is, they had an on-site 10 kilowatt solar photovoltaic system that was rendered completely inoperable because the grid was down. And that's a very solvable problem, right? Like, you can get a better inverter and put in a small battery, and they could at least been able to charge their devices. But the utility is not incentivized at all to provide a service to their customers to help them get that kind of arrangement in place so that they could mitigate the experience they would have when they have outages. And so a lot of this goes back to the regulatory compact and the incentives that we're providing to the utilities. But at the end of the day, if we're not sending the proper price signal to the consumers, then we're going to end up, and what we've set up in terms of the incentive for the utility in this case is to just continue investing in more capacity to serve these far-flung locations. And it's not that I don't want my family's community to be served, but the truth is, if it's a substantially higher cost of service to serve these communities that are more vulnerable to extreme weather events, and that's going to happen even more in coastal areas, we have to send a price signal, or else we're just going to keep socializing these costs, and the cost of everything is going to go up for everyone. So this is like the economist's dream, right? To have like actual price signals at the distribution scale, and it's tricky politically. But I really worry if we don't get it right, that like everything we're talking about here about abundance and scale, like the costs are just going to keep going up to all ratepayers.
Can I just make one more quick comment on your question, Kate? Like, using existing infrastructure, like it's part of what Tyler talks about, is using the existing, what we have now and getting more out of it. Like, one of the places that we've gone and looked is like old retiring fossil plants. There's a whole bunch of infrastructure at those plants with interconnect, with jobs, with people who actually, there's these communities that have these existing plants, you tend to love them because they're jobs, they generate a lot of income. Like, if you try to go do a greenfield, good luck with that, as we just talked about, doing a new fossil plant. But there's a lot of things that we can reuse. And by the way, the additional adder on the ITC was one way to get new infrastructure built in these energy communities. We'll see if it survives. I think it should, because I think it benefits those communities and actually allows us to reuse infrastructure. But I think it's a great question.
The Eric Schmidt estimated that we're probably about 1,000 nuclear power plant equivalents shy to handle the AI demand that he's foreseeing. And
He's our chief marketing officer.
yeah, and so probably one of the few people in the room, I actually have a nuclear engineering degree. I chose not to do it 40 years ago for good reason. But anyway, so I'm trying to figure out on the scale. The problem is so big that if that's really the demand and we wanted to run that scenario, that's what, Tyler, you were talking about out there in scenarios, I don't see how we close that gap. Or the other scenario is AI doesn't happen, or prices go outrageous for homes. And so could you give me some perspective on the thought? Because the first rule of engineering is the solution scale has to match the problem scale. And I'm not sure we're there, because I don't know how to build from here and debottleneck it when it's that huge.
Yeah. Maybe I'll take a first shot at this. When I talk about fusion, there's a lot of good things about it, frankly. The bad news is it's not here now, and it won't be before 2030. So the short answer here is we need to do everything, like squeeze as much as we can out of the system, deploy distributed infrastructure, deploy solar and battery. We need to do it all. It's a false argument to say you should do one versus the other. The classic, we should invest in miracle things, or no, we should just deploy what we have today. It's false. It's false. There's so much demand, we need it all. And if you're an investor, invest in what you like, right? And people say, but that means you're using some capital here versus there. Well, if you get down to the weeds, there's people who love investing in that stuff, and there's people who love investing in that stuff. Have at it. What I would say, it's a really good question, which is we can spend our time talking about solutions that won't eventually scale, and we're missing the boat. This is one whole reason I joined this company. And by the way, I'm a fission fan. I was a submarine officer. It was my first job. So I like fission. I love fusion. We can talk more about it. But it's it is one of the few solutions. If you're talking about abundance, what essentially is abundance? What if you had limitless energy from a fuel source that is infinitely available, endless, and available to everyone, and you remove geopolitical conflict as with respect to energy? That would be a wonderful solution, and that's what fusion can be. But it also has this ability, because it's the most energy-dense form of power. You're literally turning grams into gigawatts, and you know this as a nuclear engineer. Like, it has this ability to be deployed anywhere, everywhere, and be a very dense power source. And it is the one thing that we scale. We can talk more about what would you need to scale it. And it's one of the foundations of our company, which is like, we did not see another solution that could actually scale to the size of the problem. The size of the problem is massive. Could fission do it? Maybe, but the time scale for deployment is just so hard, and this is frankly very costly. Like, are we going to be costly? Our first one's probably going to be expensive, but we have a path to something cheap. So it's really important to think about this question, which is like, how do we close the gap to a 2050? But 2050 is one thing that you can shout out about, but like, what about 2025, 2030, 2040, 2050? We need steps all along the way, and we're not going to be there for 2030, but we think we can be an important part of what goes beyond. I was chatting with John, I think earlier, like the IPCC report that said, oh my God, we need to do something within 12 years or otherwise the world burns, and we got to focus on that. I agree. But the world doesn't end in 12 years. Like, we need solutions that go, buy some time to invest in those solutions that can scale. And in the meantime, we need to get to work on everything that we can possibly deploy right now.
I'll just say really quick, I think we've entered a zone of like crisis mentality that is like irrational to a certain extent, because like the main national security issue here is like, we need to develop the foundational models. And we don't have to train the foundational models during polar vortexes for the 3-hour period on winter mornings when like the system is stressed. Like, that is not going to be the determining factor of like whether we're going to compete in the AI race. So yes, like in a lot of jurisdictions, these forecasts, it is physically impossible to meet them. So one of three things will happen. The load will disappear, or it'll go elsewhere. The load will be a little bit flexible, 50 to 100 hours a year, so that it can get on the system with the existing capacity and maybe a little bit of expanded capacity. Or 3, we will add the new load, and it will increase loss of load expectation for all of the loads. And this goes back to the load planning and how we treat new load. Currently, if you add a new load, it is on the exact same playing field as every other load in terms of who gets shed first during a rolling blackout event. And so if we add the data centers without expanding the system or having them be flexible, we will have probabilistically more blackouts that are going to affect existing customers. And I think that's going to be a politically untenable situation. So I think get more utilization out of the existing system so we can buy time, save capital to invest in clean, firm tech that we can scale in the 2030s.
1,000 nuclear plants at a gigawatt each is about a terawatt. I think we can do a terawatt. There's about a terawatt of projects in interconnection queues. Now, some huge percentage of those aren't real projects anymore. But they might have been at one point if we had a system that worked, right? So first off, get interconnection sorted. Listen to Tyler. Second, I helped run a study with Stripe looking at off-grid solar battery gas solutions in the American Southwest and how much data center potential they could support. It's about a terawatt. Now, you'd have to scatter it all over the place, and off-grid systems have stranded asset risks and all this stuff. So there's 2 terawatts right there. Those are like, this isn't a moonshot, right? Those are right there. We just have to figure it out. And I think if we decide a terawatt's impossible, we're just cooked. It's done.
Okay, well, I think that was pretty much our solution set. We've got fixed interconnection, deploy solar and storage and a little bit of flexible gas, make data centers flexible. Oh, and let's commercialize fusion. And then I think we've basically fixed it.
Check, check, check.
Check, check, check.
And we're in a world of abundance.
That's right. That's right. That's the roadmap. Please join me in thanking our panelists.